We turn now to retired General H.R. McMaster, who served as National Security Advisor under former President Trump and is now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution out at Stanford University. It's good to have you here.
Great to be with you, Margaret.
The White House has said that there have been an alarming number of increasingly aggressive actions by the People's Liberation Army, that's China's military, in recent months. There was video of a near miss in the South China Sea in the air, and then one at sea in the Taiwan Strait recently as well. How unusual are these kind of incidents?
Well, they're not unprecedented, but it's unusual in terms of the quick succession of multiple incidents. And I think you have to consider it in context of the broad range of Chinese Communist Party and PLA aggressive action. I think China's sending a message, hey, we're in charge now. You're finished, to the West and to the United States. And I think it's indicative of what they hope to achieve, Margaret, which is to create kind of an exclusionary area of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region. They've laid claim to the ocean in the South China Sea, for example. So I think this really calls for us to have a strong response. I think, you know, with Secretary Blinken's visit there, it may portray a bit of weakness in terms of—
What do you mean?
Well, I think we've been so anxious to have this discussion with the Chinese, and the Chinese have been really playing hard to get in terms of the discussion, and saying things like, well, we have to have the right atmosphere for the talk. We have to show more respect. And I think what they hope with the optics of this meeting, and I'm sure Secretary Blinken is quite aware of this, is to create a perception that we're going there to pay homage to the Chinese Communist Party, because they want to use that kind of perception of China's strength relative to the United States to bludgeon countries in the region and say, hey, time to bandwagon with us. This is our era, what they call the new era of international relations.
Well, arguably, a lot of the Biden administration policies look a lot like the Trump administration policies, at least directionally here. Relations have been going downhill for years now. This is the first visit since 2018. So if the visit itself, you question, is a risk, how do you make this successful?
Well, I think it's okay to talk, right? Diplomacy is okay. It's just the conditions under which the discussion is conducted, and,
so what do you mean
and
by
how
that?
It's portrayed.
Location?
So I think not necessarily location, but just the atmosphere around it in connection with China really, I think, wanting to try to get some concessions in exchange for just the privilege of talking with them. And this might have to do with some policy decisions about whether or not to restrict or ask allies to restrict chip sales, for example, to Chinese industries. But I think what's really important to note is that China has not come off the path of aggression. You mentioned the People's Liberation Army aggression, but a broad range of economic aggression that China's engaged in. And so I think it's important just to stick to our guns on this, and it's important to have diplomacy with China, but let's have also diplomacy with countries that might be sitting on the fence to say, hey, your choice really at this moment is not between Washington and Beijing, it's between sovereignty and servitude.
So one of Secretary Blinken's stated goals is to help open up these lines of communication between the militaries. You can't oppose that. You must want that.
No, I think it's important to have those kind of confidence-building measures, ways to deconflict, but it takes two parties to do it.
Right.
One of the obstacles to this is the Chinese Communist Party is so centralized in terms of the power of Xi Jinping that he's unwilling to decentralize communications to anybody else at many times. When you meet with Chinese Communist Party officials, Margaret, it's typically they're reading off 5x8 cards. I mean, you try to, tell a few jokes, right? Make a personal connection. It's really hard to do.
Well, the now defense minister, his name is Li Shangfu, he's recently got that job. It was the Trump administration who put sanctions on him back in 2018 because he was buying Russian-made weaponry. That's one of the excuses the Chinese have for refusing to let him speak with Secretary Austin. Should those sanctions be lifted now?
No, I don't think they should be. But I think it's
just to get them talking. You think it's—
Well, I mean, it depends on, it's a tactical decision, but I think any perception at this stage that we would back off pressure on the CCP for its own actions that are cut against our interests would be perceived as a sign of weakness and embolden the CCP further. I mean, if you think back, remember the old policy or strategy of cooperation and engagement, right? The assumption that underpinned that is that if we cooperate and engage with China, China will come to the conclusion that it's in their interest to preserve the world order as it exists. What China wants to do is tear that order down and supplant it with a new order that's in their interest and cuts against our interests. And I think you see that played out in the South China Sea, for example, where we tried to accommodate China's interests. We didn't challenge directly for quite some time. They're laying claim to the ocean and building those islands and weaponizing them. And actually, I think what provokes China is the perception of weakness, not strength. And I think actually China's in a relatively weak position now, Margaret. I think Secretary Blinken ought to go in there recognizing but the United States is in a position of relative strength. I mean, China seems to be doing everything it can to alienate itself from much of the world, as well as destroy its own economy.
So when we recently spoke with Bob Gates, the former CIA director and defense secretary, he said, even in the worst days of the Cold War, there was at least a way for the United States and Soviet Union to have communications about these kind of military incidents to avoid escalation. That framework does not exist today with China. It doesn't one have to be created, or do you think that ambiguity or that risk is a choice? We ought to always say, hey, the door's open for that kind of communication. But I think it's up to the Chinese Communist Party. It takes two to be willing to have that line open. I think it's also important to note that over many administrations, we had these so-called dialogues, right? The security and diplomatic dialogue and economic dialogue. There was a people-to-people dialogue. What did those dialogues accomplish? Really nothing, Margaret. I think what they accomplished were really objectives that the party wanted to pursue, which is to continue to lull us into a sense of complacency with the promise of a better relationship, a reset later. Well, the better relationship never really came, at least in terms of Chinese Communist Party behavior and the continued acts of aggression. I mean, if you look at the recent incidents, think also, how about bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death in the Himalayan frontier? How about ramming and sinking Vietnamese vessels? The CCP's become very aggressive, not only against the United States, but a broad range of nations. And not even to mention, short of military aggression, how about cyber attacks? How about campaigns of economic aggression against Australia and Lithuania and others? So I think it's important to look at the behavior of the party, because they talk a great game, right? A new era of great power relationship, a community of common destiny for all mankind. Now, that sounds like a great program, right? I mean, that's not what I would want to sign up for, though, with the Chinese Communist Party in charge. So recently, it was publicly disclosed that China has set up and rebuilt part of its listening facilities that are located in nearby Cuba. Right. Secretary Blinken acknowledged that this week. Yeah. To a lot of people, they hear and see something like that and they think of the old Cold War. Right. How different is this model?
It's worse. It's worse because it's a more difficult problem set because of the way that our economies have become interconnected, in large measure based on these flawed assumptions about the nature of the relationship and especially the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party. That's what we got wrong. We thought that we could determine the behavior of the party by the way we engage them. But hey, guess what? I mean, the Chinese Communist Party leadership had aspirations that went far beyond anything in reaction to what we do. And China really does want to establish itself, as it sees it, at the center.
I want to ask you, though, in the political context we are in, because we are about to enter the heat of a presidential election year. And there are officials I've spoken to inside the administration who are concerned that China might misread our politics, might misinterpret some of the political rhetoric, and that boxes in the policymakers. How dangerous is this sort of popular hawkishness that we're hearing?
Well, I think the hawkishness is really appropriate because it's focused on Chinese Communist Party behavior that they're pursuing at our expense. Actually, I think this is a rare sort of case of bipartisan support for efforts to compete more effectively with the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm hoping that both parties, and this might be a high hope, resist trying to score partisan political points, right, by criticizing the other for being too soft for China or maybe too hard on China. Hey, let's just have a rational view of the challenge to future generations of Americans and recognize that this is a competition we, across the free world, have to prevail in.
And yet, you are already hearing it in the early campaign trail days. Sure. And foreign policy isn't usually a top issue in an election year, but When it comes to the Republican platform, you hear Taiwan brought up a lot. You hear the issue of fentanyl, the ingredients of which
Absolutely.
are made in China. Largely for Democrats, President Biden's entire economic agenda is about making the United States independent with our supply chains, rebuilding manufacturing. That's about China, too.
Absolutely.
So how do Americans think about this? If you don't want the partisanship,
Right.
how do you think about this?
Well, I think just think clearly about the threat from the Chinese Communist Party and then what we have to do to counter that threat. And the free world working together. I think all the measures that you mentioned are immensely important. Our supply chains became way too biased in favor of efficiency over resilience.
Which we learned the hard way during the pandemic.
We did. And then, other countries learned that in terms of the energy dependence on Russia. How about Germany, right? Germany gave an authoritarian regime coercive power over its economy. Let's learn from that and to recognize, hey, that's a bad idea. Now, that doesn't mean heavy-handed industrial policy, but it means doing what makes sense to ensure that we can insulate ourselves from the coercive power of the Chinese Communist Party and not trade kind of the old dependence on energy from the from the Middle East in the 70s for a new dependence on all sorts of hardware and equipment associated with the energy transition in China, battery manufacturing, for example.
Right. Before I let you go, what are the key phrases, the key things you were looking for and watching for out of this meeting?
Well, I think it's competition and a recognition on our part that the Chinese Communist Party has to change its behavior for there to be a better relationship. There's always an impulse in diplomacy to think that a better relationship is an end in and of itself. But actually, if the perception is that we're going to make concession after concession just for a better relationship, I mean, the outcome could be something that appears like a diplomatic achievement, but it could be a political disaster.
H.R. McMaster, thanks for your analysis today.
Thanks, Margaret.